It's time for Behind the Shot Image Critique number 6. Hi, everybody. Welcome to another Behind the Shot here, streaming live on YouTube. I'm Steve Brazill. As usual, this show, the critique shows, they are only on the YouTube channel, so they're streaming here. Make sure that you subscribe on the YouTube channel, and the little bell next to the subscribe button, make sure that you hit that and choose all. That way you know every time we do something new, every time we're streaming, every time I upload a video and publish a video, you'll know about it. For the normal Behind the Shot shows, you can find those here on YouTube as well, but you can also find those in your favorite podcast app. If your podcast app supports video, it's actually available in an audio-only format or a video format. Subscribe to whichever one that you want. And you can find all the blog posts and show notes at behindtheshot.tv. And that brings us up to my guest, or I should say my co-host for the critique shows, Don Komarechka. How are you?
I'm great. And please click that little bell. Make Steve happy. This show is something that we do pro bono just for the fun of it. And we really hope that people enjoy it. But we also need to get more people watching it. It's been growing, but I want to make sure that that trend continues. Tell your friends. Submit more images. This is something that I think that we can all benefit from, that we can all grow from, even if we're not critiquing your images. There's something very useful here for everybody to learn from, or at least that's the idea.
And speaking of participating, all you have to do is go over to Flickr, join Flickr. You can do a paid account, you can do a free account. Then join the Behind the Shot group on Flickr and submit your photos to the group. Now, just submitting your photos to the group is just for fun. Everybody can comment on them and like them, and we can all have fun over there. But if you add the tag, and it's not a hashtag, Flickr has their own tagging system. If you add a Flickr tag of Btscritique, all one word, no spaces, being in the Behind the Shot group and having the tag, that's what makes the image eligible for either Don or I to pick the images for the critique. And what we do, each show, we alternate who's picking the images. Don picked them today, which means I'm going to go first, which actually scares me a little bit. But if I do want to mention up front, if you ever have any questions about the critique shows, there are chats or discussions over at Flickr. You can do that there, or you can hit either one of us up on social media. All right, so that's the easiest thing to do. Now, before we get into the first show, I'm going to clear my throat. And thank God for a mute button, but for some reason, the weather lately just has these allergies kicking up really, really bad. So, Don, you ready to go?
I am. This is going to be fun. I'm really curious to see what you think about the first image.
See, and you picked this image. My voice is going nuts today. It's weird. Excuse me. So, this first image is called Gooseberry Negative. And this one, when you picked it first, I know you picked it first knowing I was going to go first, and this is your type of a shot. And there's a lot of things in this image that I really like. First of all, the negative concept is fantastic. I love that you did this as a negative. It's creative, it's unique, it gives a depth and a feel to it that I don't think a standard photo would do. It's kind of like what infrared does to me. I love that type of a feel. One of the main things I love about this image to the maker is that the background is not solid black. So many people would have made that background area solid black so that that gooseberry really popped out. But the fact that it's not 100% black, to me, makes it feel more like a negative. It makes it feel like it has more depth. It makes it just much more appealing to me. Here's my problem. The bottom part of the gooseberry, the exposure is uneven to me in a way that's uncomfortable. You've got that spot in the middle. And I'm not sure what that's from, if that's some kind of a seed pod or something in the middle that accepted light.
You have no idea what this is, Steve. That makes it even more fun. But continue.
Yeah, see, and that's the thing. And I knew you picked this to mess with me. My apologies. My voice has been... I've been doing these shows with Skip Cohen, the F64, with you, the F64 Lunch Bunch, and my voice is just trashed at this point, so I apologize. So anyway, so that hot spot in the middle... whether it's natural or not, it's uncomfortable for me to look at. I'd still burn it down, right? This clearly is not trying to be natural, so you don't have to stay natural. Go in and work this image a little bit. The bottom white edges, to me, are way too hot, too bright, and the center glow is obvious. There's a blemish in the front part about, just above halfway on the left-hand side. I'd fix the blemish, and here's my biggest thing that I would fix on this. It's over-sharpened to me.
Yeah.
So treat sharpening, treat clarity, treat all of that stuff subtly. Less is always more. Don, what do you got?
Well, you stole my thunder on a couple of those points, including the sharpening. Now, what's referred to as gooseberry here is also referred to as a tomatillo, or a Chinese lantern fruit. And they have these casings in front of the, around the fruit that you kind of peel off. And then inside that central area that you were referring to, Steve, that is the fruit inside of this structure. And so that was kind of an interesting thing to see. It's inverted in two ways. These normally hang down. It's flipped upside down, and it's inverted in terms of the color. So it's inverted twice, which I found was an interesting play on that whole concept. There's a little speckle in the middle that doesn't match the entire pattern that I might clone out. And the stem is a little bit darker than it should be at the very, very bottom of the frame. The over sharpening, especially on the outer edges, is very obvious because when you over sharpen something that's out of focus, it becomes painful. And so your depth of field here is very shallow. And while the main leaf, if that's the proper term, in the middle is sharp, the edges are a little bit further away and they become less sharp as a result. And then when you over sharpen that, it becomes very obvious. So just pay attention to the post-processing on that. But the image overall, I quite like. All of your points for improvement, I would agree with. If you could bring down a little bit of the highest, brightest areas, I think you'd have a greater image as well. But I love the simplicity of it. Let's move on to the next one.
The simplicity of it. And let me say to the maker, I would hang this on a wall. It's just the sharpness is really unappealing to me, to my eye. Would you burn down that middle part?
Knowing what it is and that's the fruit inside, no. But I might focus stack this to extend the depth a little bit further towards those outer edges, which would also extend the depth to the center area and give it a more defined shape as well.
See, and I disagree with that. I actually would like to see the edges of that, like even the front leaf. I would like to see that naturally fall off to a slightly softer blur. All right, we're ready for the next image?
Yeah, let's dig into it. So this one, green machine, I guess I go for this one. And so this is a really fun concept. I love the juxtaposition of man-made things in nature whenever I can find them. And you've got just what looks like decades of moss growing on a car that, I mean, I might debate whether or not that car should actually be there. Maybe somebody should have pulled it out of this beautiful natural scene. But this is what you got. This is what you're seeing. And the waterfall in the background is beautiful. The decay, the almost like I would call urban decay of the structure just kind of fading back into nature. There's a great story there. But could it have been told from a slightly different angle? You've got the water coming down and you can see it kind of cut off by the top of the vehicle. And then you can see the stream off in the lower right-hand corner. And that's great. I'm glad that the stream is a component of the frame, but that should be an unbroken element where the waterfall will flow into that stream. And even if it's just a tiny sliver of that, just that stays consistent across, it would guide your eye along that much stronger than having it just kind of broken right mid-frame and right center. So if you were to, bring your rubber boots, go into the water yourself, frame the vehicle on the left side of the frame, or the right, either way, it doesn't matter. But just frame something where you've got that unbroken water flow and the vehicle within the composition at the same time.
You stole almost everything that I was going to say. And with the broken stream idea, let me give you a kind of an analogy on that. And that was, I've got shots of the guitarist for the band Korn that I love, Monkey, and I've never published him for one reason. His arm looks super weird. And the reason is that, and I'm going to actually put myself full screen so you can see it, but if you picture the arm, the guitar actually cuts the full elbow from mid-bicep to mid-bicep to mid-forearm. And so what you end up with at that point is just like this floating forearm coming out of the side of the guitar. Some connection between those two things really, really helps with continuity, right? So a couple of things I love about this. I'm exactly like Don. Man-made stuff in nature, especially taken over by nature, is such a cool thing. This is not overcooked. I really think a lot of people might have taken this shot and pushed it too far. And you did not push this too far. It's realistic color, and yet it's vibrant. I could see this in a movie, actually. I could picture like army guys coming down or something in a war scene. What I would love to see is more breathing room, right? Not only the angle of rotating so I can see the stream connect to the waterfall, but the car is so tight to the left side edge of the stream, a little bit more breathing room. And I'm not even saying a lot, but a little bit more breathing room over there would really, really help. And the stream, let me add this to the stream part. The stream effectively is a secondary subject, right? So it's a secondary subject even more than the jungle is. So that's part of the reason that you need that stream to connect to that firewall and me to be able to see the firewall and the firewall. I'm an IT guy. The waterfall. The waterfall is blown out. And I really wish that the waterfall was not blown out. In fact, that whole back area, if you burned all the ferns and the waterfall down, I think it would match the car exposure, which is awesome. And I think it would just really bring that focus more to the subject that's in the front. Anything else you got on this one?
Try it at night with light painting and have some fun.
Oh, Ken Lee would love doing that with this one. I think we have a Ken Lee picture in here actually this week too. So this next one is called SCSenior or Shermansenior. And there's a couple of things I love about this shot. And by the way, this type of a shot, notice this doesn't appear to be an actual track meet, right? This is a staged photo. It appears based on time of day, based on the fact that you've clearly added some light in some way, it looks like. Mm-hmm. So if you're looking to get better at sports photography, go out to a high school field, seriously, and stage some shots like this. Because in this particular case, the maker of this shot, and his name is on here, Jeremy, perfect timing, getting that toe standing right at the tip of the toes, right at the light. Absolutely love that. The tree line, he positioned the jumper, the long jumper, it's a long jump that he's doing, in the dip of the tree, which I actually like as well. So he kind of becomes a tall tree in the low area of the trees. The light on the grass you've treated nicely. It's artificial, it looks like at least. It could be, I suppose, field lights that are turned on. But the way it falls from the darker grass at the front back to the light, I love how you treated all of that. His body positioning, though, meaning I'm talking about the posing, his face, his arms, all of that. If this is a setup shot, right, not a meet, pose him, talk to him, let him know what you want him to do, what you don't want him to do. His facial expression, try and get him to not make an unusual jumper's face. Try and get him to have his hands forward, or if they're up, sideways, not straight up, because the problem with that arm being straight up is the sky is not interesting. And I would rather crop the top of this picture down, thereby raising the horizon line off center, raising him up, making it a little bit more pano, but I can't do that because his arm is there. So I'm stuck with all of that sky that's not really helping me. Get that horizon line above center, below center, something. And with that, I think you should be pretty good. Oh, one other thing, actually. His color is off to me. This picture has a super nice warm feel to it. He seems too cool in this scene. I might take actually an adjustment brush and warm him up just a little bit.
Yeah, and so that's probably because artificial light is on him, but not on sort of the sunset and the natural landscape. I totally get that point. I love the fact that he is sort of like mid-air, the position between the sun and the foot. That's great. Your points about the arm is fantastic as well. But I don't really see a sense of motion here. It's like he's sort of suspended in the air. And I know as nobody would be, but I don't know if he's like jumping straight up, if he's moving forward or backward, how much momentum he has. That's missing from the story. And so I would do some experimenting. I would try to do a longer exposure with a rear curtain sync on the flash so that the flash fires at the very end of the exposure rather than the beginning. And that means that you might get a ghosted image of him moving up to the final position where the flash fires. And that could be kind of useful. Possibly doing a multiple exposure effect where you've got somebody moving from position to position, and then you have that sort of progression as well. I'm not saying any of those ideas are necessarily better than this, but I'm saying that that kind of experimentation is perfect when you've got, a cooperative actor, let's, call it that, somebody in the image, and carry forward, and hopefully they will agree with your experimentation and get some exercise out of it.
Yeah, and again, I can't stress enough, go stage this, right?
Yeah.
Stage a long jump, stage a high jump, stage a track run, right? You can go out to most fields late at night and get some ambient light from the city and add a little bit of artificial light and play with doing these kind of shots and come up with some really, really cool stuff.
And Gary,
Okay,
in the,
this next one, you go first.
Hold on. Gary in the chat says closer and lower with a wide angle could be cool to show the exertion. And so I agree with you there as well, Gary. Keeping the people in the chat
actually, that's a
involved.
really good point. And Gary, thanks for coming in.
Yeah.
You ready for stars?
Yeah, so this is a beautiful Milky Way shot with a nice landscape. And one of the things that I like about night landscape images that have a nice star field is that once you've done this a handful of times yourself, you realize that the star field is always the star field. I mean, it is the background to whatever is interesting that you put in the foreground. And that really helps define a shot. And I've seen some really overcooked images. This, I could tell that they've pushed the sky pretty far based on what I know the output of the camera would have genuinely been. But the connection between the sky and the landscape below it works really well. The angle of the Milky Way cutting across the frame works really well. The fact that if the camera was too low to the surface of the water, then you would lose the separation between the islands. That little sliver of water that you're seeing through a lot of those components is broken by a tree in one part. I get that. But if the camera was too low to the ground, then everything would just be chunked together and it wouldn't feel like there's a progression from one thing to the next to the next. I don't know how much of your thunder I've stolen, Steve, but I'll pass it back to you.
Almost all of it, actually. Not even kidding. So this is multiple shots. According to the EXIF data, the Earth was a 5-second shot, but the sky is actually 31 photos. And I'm okay with that. There's a lot of things in this I love, but because of that, there are some flaws in the image that I think could be fixed by the maker. So first of all, the Milky Way is really, really well done. The center of the Milky Way is super nice black, super rich. I love the way that you did the sky. And the fact that Don mentioned this, and I'm going to reiterate it, but the angle of the Milky Way coming to the point of the mountains in the back, in the lower part of the mountains, really, really nice angle that you've done on this. And the two islands, the fact that you have water visible in between, that you have separation between those two islands, that actually can't be overstated. To me, that's a critical part of this image working as well as it does. But the mountain edge has a halo, and it's not the normal halo like I talk about a lot, and that is like a white line. It has a blur halo where you've blended. And I mean, actually the halo, the blurring is fairly pronounced and wide. There is no substitute for zooming into 400% and cleaning that up and doing those blends properly. There's no way to get around doing that.
It's a pretty simplistic edge too, right? I mean, like, it's not like you've got a whole tree line that's really jagged and everything. So it would be a relatively easy fix.
And for that matter, the peaks in the back are super sharp. You could even blur the peaks because they're so far away. Those two pointed ones right at the tip of the Milky Way. You could even blur those a little bit to help you blend it in, and it would look super, super natural.
I don't know about that, because if you're blurring those peaks, then the stars would have to be as equally blurry, right?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, but I'm not talking blur. I'm just talking you could soften that edge because there's no tree line. It's such a straight line. I think you could soften that edge a little bit to blend it into the sky. I don't think it would kill the image, whereas the over-sharpening to me of those peaks, the over-sharpness, I should say, that distracts me because it seems that distance a little off. The front island to me is a little bit too dark. I would lighten that front island up a little bit. I understand it's nighttime. I understand the exposure that you're going for, but a couple of little brighter spots on that island, I think would bring it in. And but nice shot. I could never do this. I'll say it right up front.
Yeah, technically
ready for the next one?
Beautiful. Yeah, and talking about sharpness, you take this one first, but do you see where this whole trend of over sharpening might take you on this one?
Yeah. There's, first of all, to the maker of this shot, what timing. You awesome. Got full wing spread, you got nice profile, you've got the claws curled in, you've got the snow blurry, you got him, or her I should say, you've got the bird against the darkest spot of the background with the tree where the two trees kind of kick in or connect. Really, really nice timing on this. I love the way you captured the weather, and before I say my but, I do want to point out, this was shot at 450 millimeters, okay? That's not an easy shot. Now, I'm going to assume at that you were on a monopod or a tripod, though, and the eyes are just not in focus here. In fact, if you look at the sharpest spot, it's the little feathers under the wing. And the eyes need to be in focus, and it looks like you tried to go back in and sharpen them, which rarely will work. It can help an image, but if you go too far, it kind of gets a little squirrely there. For me, looking at your EXIF data on this, you were only at ISO 1600 on a D850. I would have cranked that up a full stop to 3200, which would have enabled you to get more than an f6.3 at 450 millimeters and boosted that depth of field a little bit. It would have just helped you a tad bit. I understand your panning. I understand the zoom that you're working with. I think it could have helped. And the biggest thing to me, at the right resolution, at a small resolution, most people may not actually notice some of the soft areas in this image that I wish were sharp. But the bird is dead center. And you were probably using the center focus point. Okay, you might have been using a zone. But if the bird was frame left with nose room to fly into just a little bit, it would add a lot to this image.
Yeah, and I think I pretty well agree with everything that you said. You didn't mention, at least prolifically as much, the background placement and the contrast that affords the image, which I think is really helpful here. If that dark spot on the background, which might be a tree, I can assume, or something similar, without that, the subject wouldn't pop. Right. And so the exact positioning of that background really helps frame the image. And that can't be understated. But when you mention the eye being slightly out of focus, if I look at some other parts of the image, particularly the feet, the tip of the beak, there's evidence of motion blur within that. And so motion blur, of course, would be a type of blur. And I think that might have also affected other parts of the image, including the eyes. It's perfectly fine on the wings. That's understandable. It's expected, and it's actually beautiful. But when it's affecting other parts of the image, then that's when over sharpening that is not going to be in your favor. And you stole my thunder on this one about increasing the ISO by a stop, because that would double or cut your shutter speed in half, and that would remove that kind of blur, and you wouldn't need to depend on sharpening to enhance the image. Everything else you said, Steve, I agree with.
Yeah, and actually, let me touch on the wings, because you brought up the wings. Seeing blur in the edge of the wings is wonderful. A lot of bird photographers like sharpness past the tips of the wings, where it connects to the bird. So you've got that going on. You shot this at a really fast shutter speed, but there's a couple of just minor adjustments I think that you could make that would probably improve the shot. So Don, before we move on any further, because we're about halfway through, catch me up on what's happening with your podcasts. Tell me about all your podcasts.
Yeah, so Photo Geek Weekly at photogeekweekly.com is my weekly foray into the industry news, which just recorded before we started this one with Alan Attridge, and I'll be editing that, putting it out either later today or tomorrow. And we're at episode 102 now. So we are into the triple digits on that one. Thank you for everybody that's been listening. And so you can find my podcast and my conversations there, and my website at doncom.ca. That's donkom.ca, where you can get in touch with me by many different means.
Okay, but you didn't mention the new thing.
Well, I thought that was what you
have to mention the new thing.
So we're doing this thing. We've done it all last week. The F64 Lunch Bunch, which was pioneered by Skip Cohen, a wonderful industry veteran, let's call him. That he's worked in executive level positions at Polaroid and Hasselblad, and he knows the community, and he can bring us all together. And so we've been doing. Last week we did it every day of the week. This week, I think we did Wednesday. I wasn't on the panel this week, but I'll be back on again in the future. Every Wednesday, we do this live at 2 p.m. Eastern. And it's like ask questions to industry pros, people that you look up to, people that you are inspired by, that you've learned from and continue to learn from, especially right now from a professional photographer standpoint. We hit a lot of the business stuff, but just from a creative standpoint, if you want to stay creative and stay productive, then tune in to the F64 Lunch Bunch, which you can find where, Steve?
And we've had some amazing guests. We had Joe McNally on last week. Yesterday, we had Lori Nordstrom and Melissa Guionis and Dixie Dixon on. and Shamira Young is a regular from Photo Focus fame, is one of the regular panelists actually on the show. Dawn's a regular panelist. That's not the one I was talking about. Can you talk about the other thing yet?
Oh, yes, the DP Review TV.
That's the one I was talking about.
That's the one, yeah. So the very first episode of that has come up. I am now a host on DP Review TV for a new series of DIY mad scientist photography stuff. And so if you go to youtube.com/DP Review, you'll find one video of mine up right now. Please go watch it. It's about freezing soap bubbles, and I know that we are warmer than that right now for the majority of people in the world. But check out the video. There will be more at-home science-y goodness for you to explore as new episodes come out. The next one, I believe, will be coming out on the weekend, but I don't have confirmation on that yet. But there will be more. I'm trying to do this bi-weekly. So check that out, enjoy it, and give me feedback, because you'll make the show better when you do.
Well, and congratulations to you, because nobody deserves it more, my friend. Gary had a comment on the bird shot, actually. He said, although a great shot, I wonder if the shot needs a story piece. Great bird shot just hanging there, but I don't shoot birds, yep. is what he's saying.
Good point.
So he's not sure. But I agree, maybe another story piece, but I really like the bird shot. The biggest thing to me on that bird shot actually was the composition, and that it was dead center, and I kind of wish that it was a little off. So I think, am I up first on this next one?
I think I am, because you started off with the Blue Jay. So I'll dig into this. Interesting train station imagery, playing heavily on the reflection, right? I mean, that's one of the main goals of this photograph. And so when you're doing what amount to street photography using multiple elements, I always find the wet streets that have a bit of reflection, even if it's not clear, to be very interesting. But what is the subject in this image? That's the first question that comes to mind. What is the primary focus? I've got the one man in the foreground, and he's not looking at the camera. He's not doing anything interesting. I can't see his hands. He's not a very prominent subject, but he's all we've got here. Maybe if somebody else was walking by that had something of greater interest, where I could see his hands, or like a second later, he might be more interesting than he is in this particular moment, which brings me to the work of Henri Cartier-Bresson, if I use a French accent, because I'm actually mostly French, but his work is the decisive moment, and there's a lot of stuff in there that one moment, a second before or after, could be so much more meaningful than this moment that we're seeing, because those subtle differences make a huge impact on the work. I know that you've got some stuff to talk about too, Steve. I do want to also say that you've tried to recover highlights too far. The sky.
Where are you seeing that? In the sky. Okay.
Yeah, if you look at the sky, especially if you look at the reflections below, they're about the same brightness as the sky above. The sky was blown out white. Just leave it blown out white. That's just what you're going to get. If you bring it down from that, then it just becomes blobs of gray. And even though there is little detail in there, it's also accentuating, when you bring that down, any chromatic aberrations around those high contrast edges, and you're getting some color fringing as a result of that, because you're trying to overcome that brightness. And so there's some blue lines that I'm seeing within there that shouldn't be there, because you're just pushing your camera beyond its limits. Know those limits, work within those limits, and you'll be solid.
I love and agree with everything that you said, and yet I love this image. Absolutely love it. This is one of those reflection images that just works. Yes, it's dead center. The reflection mirrors. What he's talking about, by the way, on the sky is normally your sky will not be the same as any reflection. Reflections are inherently darker. So if they're the same, something got changed almost every time. Not always, but almost every time. I don't mind it. I wish that you would do something to pull that fringing out, to pull that chromatic aberration out. But that said, to me, the subject is the train station. And I like that. I love the reflections being as sharp as the signs. I love the way you've assembled everything. Excuse me, my voice is just dying today. I love where you've got the man, the pole, that you've got the train. And there's some things that you did in this compositionally that, while the man is not super interesting, You laid things out. Your timing was great. First of all, your angle, like you're on a platypod. Fantastic angle to shoot this from. The man happens to land exactly between two red doors. He doesn't intersect the red doors in any way that affects them. Same with the person behind. The signs, the fact that the signs are super sharp. Even the back wall is sharp. Yeah, maybe too sharp, but still, I like it. There's just a number of things. There's a couple things I think that would fix it aside from the stuff Don talked about. The clock and LED board on the left under the number 4 are too bright. Burn those down, okay? Same with the paper that's on the pole. The paper on the pole doesn't need to be that bright. It's really drawing my attention along with the signs, and it doesn't need to be. Bring that down. In fact, I would even add a little clarity or texture on those signs, the LED signs, to make them, and for that matter, the text signs like the blue sign, to make them pop out just a little bit more. But overall, with everything Don said, I mean, I wish the guy was doing something more interesting. But as just a street photography moment of a train station where the train station, and because of the reflections and everything, is really the story, I actually really like this shot.
If that old guy was doing a heel click and jumping for joy, I'd be really happy about this image.
Even if he was smoking,
it needs that sense of action to build the narrative for me. But I agree with everything that you said too.
Yeah, even if he was just smoking, or if he was,
I don't encourage anybody to
smiling
take up smoking for
on
a
a phone, and you wondered what the phone conversation was. Those little things, or he's looking to the side. I do prefer that, by the way, over him looking straight.
Yeah.
So next image. This one is called A Little Fun in the Desert. And man, that is a classic 1970 Bronco. I haven't seen one of those forever. This is photojournalistic. I love that you captured, an off-road racer in a photojournalistic kind of method. He's more frame right. He's got room to move on the left, but you've got the dust cloud behind him. The Bronco is sharp enough that I can read the actual sponsor stickers that are on the side of the Bronco. He's pretty sharp. Here's where this image to me has some issues that could have been fixed during shooting. Some could have been fixed in post. The aspect ratio of this shot really doesn't work for me. This is a standard 4:3 capture. It really needs to be just a little less than that, with more room in front of him, maybe even a little dust behind him. And the biggest thing is the processing. The processing on this image is flat. Yes, there are some darks. Yes, there are probably too many lights, but the spread of that histogram isn't the right contrast. You really need to go into a levels adjustment or a curves adjustment and really adjust the contrast on this to bring down the areas that you need and bring up the areas that you need to add more contrast to it. Even a little more vibrance to make that yellow on the Bronco pop would be really nice. There's too much foreground. I don't need that much of blurred dirt in front of it. There's even a little too much sky. I'd probably crop the sky below that top cloud that's bleeding off of the top. But the biggest thing to me is the sky. The sky is hazy and gray with dust and overexposed. And that would be really hard because you've got windows to do it through and you've got roll bars where the sky shows through. But if you could in some way bring, whether it be an HSL slider in the right spot or something like that, if you could in some way bring that sky down, and I don't mean crop it down, I do mean crop it down too, but if you could bring the blues down, bring the luminosity of that sky down and of him up, I think it would be better. And there's one thing in this image, and I'm curious, actually, Don, if you understand this. This wasn't shot at that high of an ISO. ISO 1000 on a D500. This thing is so noisy.
So
I'm sorry, ISO 160. I was looking at the shutter speed 1000. ISO 160 on a D500 should be clean.
Unless you have really
extremely noisy.
Unless you've really pushed the post-processing to bring up the shadows, which is where you'll reveal the noise. And if you do that,
exactly, and
his
face
also
is nothing but noise.
Right. And so if you're going to do that, you should also know that you can apply noise reduction, but there's only so much that you're going to get out of the shadows. Obviously, you're going to get more out of the shadows than you will out of overexposed highlights, but you're not going to be able to make it the same. So try to get that exposure as you see it. Steve, you mentioned making the sky a little bit darker, a little bit punchier. You can do that with a polarizing filter as well in camera, not necessarily in post. And so if you have the chance to reshoot something like this, possibly a polarizing filter might be helpful. There's a parallax effect here where the foreground is going to be having more motion blur than the background. But what I can tell is there's almost the same amount of foreground blur to the background horizon and none in the sky whatsoever. And so that brings me to a secondary reason here to modify the sky. Maybe just apply a motion blur effect in Photoshop along the exact same axis, just to blur the clouds slightly, to give, I think the clouds don't need to be properly detailed. They just they have to be there. But if they could continue the same level of motion across the frame, that could be very useful. And do a local adjustment on the dirt that's being kicked up by the back tires, and increase the texture within that, just to really give a gritty sense of this image without overdoing the entire thing, just in that one area to make it feel more volumetric.
And you could, by the way, you could massage, and let me start with this. Great capture. Don't misunderstand me on this. Great capture. The noise is really a problem because at first I wasn't even sure he was sharp because the noise affects the perceived sharpness of an image. But you could massage this image as it sits all over the place and end up with a killer shot, right? The ground in front of it could be burned down because it's farther out. If you bring the sky down, bring the ground down, add some contrast and texture to the dust cloud behind it. Lot that you could do to this image. Just an awful lot that you could do. Okay, let's jump to the next one. And this one is a fun one. I'm so glad that you picked this.
This just made me smile. I had to keep this in the group. So you've got some little, a lot of times people will use like little Lego minifigs for these kinds of setups, but these look like they're hand
Minifigs. I like that.
Yes. So in this case, we've got just a fun scene, a juxtaposition of scale. I love the fact that the cookie is kind of broken and somebody's kind of standing in there, and there's people that are moving around as if they're about to clean up the mess that has been made from whatever disaster caused the cookie to crumble. But that's just the way the cookie crumbles. So there's a story. And it's a constructed
You didn't just do that.
That's
the way the cookie crumbles.
No, I didn't. Okay, so, but there is a narrative here, and I think that's one of the hardest things to establish in an image like this is a narrative, and it's there. Things to improve. Well, you don't need to have all of the little cookie crumbs around the edges. There's one on the very far left edge, and there's one in the background too. There's actually a couple of little things in the background that just need to be cloned out and cleaned up so that the focus of this image is more on the scene that we have. I might consider some possibly different lighting. You've got some pretty big shadows around the bottom of the cookie. And so that, while it's not a distraction, it's also not very dynamic. It seems fairly flat. And if something could be used to fill in those shadows, it could be an advantage for the scene. Also, and this might not be immediately obvious, but if the angle of the camera was lower to the point where you are more perpendicular to the glass plate, the reflections on the plate would become more prominent. And if they're more prominent, then they would have a stronger impact within the image. And they're there in this scene, but they're not that impactful. And I just want a scene like this to have more impact as a result. What say you, Steve?
It's interesting that on this one, you picked on almost everything that I hadn't thought of. So there's a couple of things. First of all, let me start with the really good stuff. This is super creative. I love that you did this, that you thought of the Oreo. You've got painters. The guy that is in the cookie doesn't have the bucket. He's got the different uniform, but his paintbrush is sitting down in front, right? It just brings everything to life. I like the depth of field in this. Originally, when this thing popped up, I didn't like the bottom left corner. I didn't like that I could see the edge of the plate and darkness there. The more I look at it, I actually do kind of like that. It puts into perspective the reality that we're looking at a plate with a cookie on it. But then that means I don't need that much white, pure white, doing nothing at the top of the frame. It's just, there's too much headroom over the cookie to me. I'm not saying cut it down a lot. There's just too much. But if you look, right even with the top of the cookie, on the back white part of the plate, there's a sensor spot. You need to clean that sensor spot up. And at the same time, what Don said, the cookie crumbs on the left and the cookie crumbs behind the guy on the right are distracting. They're too close to him. So I would take those out as well. Here's my biggest thing with this image. And I think it could be fixed in post. It would have been nice to fix it somehow during shooting. It could just be a white balance issue. The filling looks very unappealing. It's got a tinge to it, a color cast to it. It doesn't look like the normal Oreo white filling. And it almost looks like it's been sitting out under lights for a long period of time. I wish that there was a way that you could go in there, maybe in post-production, change the white balance, bring it a little bit whiter, bring it a little bit more appealing and less oily looking. Because again, it just looks like it's been sitting out under lights for a long period of time. And the whole idea here is I should want to eat that cookie. It's still food photography, and I should want to eat that cookie.
Well said. Now, what say you about our final image? Because you open and close this one. We got 9 images today.
So this image has so much that I like about it. And to the maker of the image, next time you go there, man, there's so much that I would tell you to do. First of all, I believe, and this is me, this is subjective. Let me start with that. These type of images are always better in a landscape orientation than a portrait orientation for my taste. But if you're going to do one in a portrait orientation, you did so much right. The warm color treatment on the sunset is wonderful. The use of a foreground, midground, and background subject. You've got the big rock in the front. You've got little rocks in the middle. They all line up to the low part of the valley in between the two hills or two mountains. You did so much right. Here's where this image completely, very quickly, by the way, sucks me out of the scene. There's 2 things. Over sharpening. If you look at the highlights in the rocks in the front, and even more pronounced, by the way, the rocks on the left-hand center side of the frame, you have highlight artifacts that are very, very unnatural in how those highlights are reacting with the scene. And that most likely is, I'm guessing it actually may be too much clarity, not just sharpening, which is like a mid-tone sharpening is what clarity is. So that's one problem. The horizon line is dead center, and it doesn't work in this image to have the horizon line dead center. I would actually focus on the sky, bring everything down. The big rock I like, but the puddle of water that's dead and not reflecting anything, I don't necessarily need that at the very bottom. So I would crop up from the bottom, bringing the horizon line down. And then here's the other of those 2 things, the highlight artifacts and this one. You have that white halo, mostly not so much on the left mountain, but the right, I mean, you can see it even at a distance when the image is small. The entire right mountain has a white line across the top, and in the middle where they meet at the valley, it's extremely pronounced.
Yeah.
There is no substitute for zooming in, checking your edges, and cleaning those edges up. And I want to say one last thing on the sharpening. We all get soft shots. I would actually rather see a shot that's slightly soft than over sharpened. I mean, in a perfect world, it would be sharp in camera, right? But I would almost always rather see a shot that was slightly imperfect, but a beautiful scene that told me the story, than a shot that's over sharpened, because then it just sucks me out of the scene.
Right. I agree with a lot of what you said, Steve. I think that this image has too much going on in it. You've got a lot of foreground rocks. And again, if you're applying the standard mentality of foreground, middle ground, background, you can do that by cropping up and maybe even going like super narrow, like make this a really strong vertical image where you just have the very central part of the frame. So you get rid of the large rock on the right and the larger rock on the left. Just crop into that and then up so that you just get the surface of the water. Then you're framing it, that becomes your foreground. the middle ground becomes the rocks right in the middle, and then your background becomes the sky, however much of that you want to include, but you don't need a whole lot. That kind of plays into the mentality that not many landscape photographers will take, just by the virtue of it's not intuitive. You don't need to take everything in. Photography is a subtractive art. Narrow things down to the core ingredients. Keep narrowing them down until you break the image and take one step back. And then in its simplicity, it becomes more beautiful as a result. Everything else you said, I agree with.
There's one other thing here, and that is this is the perfect shot for a platypod. I do actually think it appears as though you were standing. This is a shot that really would greatly benefit from lowering that angle of view and shooting across those rocks to really feel the length of that lake. I think would dress it up a lot.
Well, and you have to understand, too, that when you lower the angle, the rocks in the middle, at least as I see it, they are a huge point of success for an image like this. If you go too low, then they get interrupted with the horizon and everything beyond it. You still want to have some isolation, having water on both sides of it. But that being said, a lower angle can still achieve that for you.
Yeah, kind of like we talked about on that Milky Way shot earlier,
That's right.
The separation between the islands mattered. So these are all things you want to keep in mind. But the biggest thing to me is the halo on that shot. You've got to, because that's fixable. You can fix that in post. You've got to go in and fix that. There's just no substitute for it. So Don, one more time, if you would, tell people about Photo Geek Weekly. Tell people about all of your stuff and your book.
Geek out about photo stuff at photogeekweekly.com. Follow me and contact me at doncom.ca. And I have a macro book that is coming out. It should have been done already. I apologize. I have a rampaging preschooler in my home office at this point. So productivity is not exactly where I'd like it to be. But if anybody does place an order for it, or you've already placed an order, just email me and ask for some sample pages. I'll give you a big chunk of the book. And Steve, what did you think of that?
I loved it. I love the, here's what's cool, because Don did send me a PDF of some sample pages to look through. And what I love about it is you could not be a macro photographer and sit down and really get something out of the pages that I read. But if you want the radical technical detail, that's also there for you, but you don't need to read that part. Literally, it's a one-stop encyclopedia of macro photography to me. That's a good way to word it. It's like an encyclopedia of macro photography.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And how about you, Steve? What do you got going on? Where can people find you?
All the normal stuff. They can find me at stevebrazill.com. They can find the podcast at behindtheshot.tv. I'm Steve Brazill, or Behind the Shot TV on social media, except Facebook, but I'm rarely there. And I try and answer everything, so make sure that you reach out. Don and I are doing the thing with Skip Cohen, the F64 Lunch Bunch. You can find that at skipcohenuniversity.com or at Skip Cohen University on YouTube is where the past episodes go up. And the one we did last Friday with Joe McNally, man, was that amazing.
That was so much fun.
I
could just sit down and listen to his stories for 10 hours.
I've seen him speak live, and let me tell you, if you ever get the chance to watch Joe McNally do a keynote, do not miss it. He is just that good, that real. His life stories are just amazing. His photography is amazing. That was really, really fun. So that's pretty much all that I'm doing. And again, people can find me on social media. Hit me up, have fun. I do want to say, Gary in the chat room, thanks. Larry said he enjoyed the show today. Thank you, Larry, for stopping by. Boris was here.
Boris
we had a number of people.
liked seeing this in my frame, the box of Ektachrome in behind me, which I'm glad somebody picked up on that. So thank you, Boris.
Reminder, if you want to get in on this, make sure that you go to Flickr, join the Behind the Shot group on Flickr. And again, it can be a free Flickr account or a paid Flickr account. If you pay, they could use the helper in these days, but I understand if you can't, do the free account. And join the Behind the Shot group, submit your photos to the group. That just gets it to where everybody can talk about them and we can all have fun together. But if you also tag it with a Flickr tag, not a hashtag, Flickr tag, Btscritique, that adds it to the pool of images that we choose from for the critique shows. As always, I'm Steve Brazill. This is Behind the Shot. The critique shows, a reminder as well, only available on the YouTube channel or at the website, behindtheshot.tv. The normal shows, where we try and get inside the mind of a great photographer by taking a close look at one of their shots. I've had it described as interviewing a photo to learn about the photographer. Those normal shows you can find at behindtheshot.tv as well. Thanks for joining us. This is Behind the Shot.
you.